Hello, students. Welcome to Chapter 12 in Lifespan Development on Gender Development and Sexuality. So, we'll spend the first half of this chapter on gender development in pretty much early life, and then the rest of it on sexuality and how that changes across the lifespan, with a pretty big focus on adolescence and early adulthood. So to get started, let's talk about gender. So gender is the characteristics, the attitudes, the feelings, and the behaviors that any given culture associates with a person's apparent biological sex. So a biological sex in this context is for us the biological sex assigned at birth. That being said, this has a lot more diversity and fluidity, the biological sex, than we previously knew. So, as we've learned more about things like the hormones and the endocrine system and genetics and the genome and chromosomes and have a lot better measurement tools, we see that there's actually a lot more variation in human biological sex than we previously believed. So, with that being said, if you want a little more detail on biological sex, we're really not going to dive into it in a lot of depth, but there's a couple videos linked here in the slides that you can watch. So the first couple kind of give a general overview from things like SciShow or Crash Course, and then this last one is actually a person who learned that they were intersex when they were 16. So talking about their experience with that. So again, not a big focus on the biology of sex. Take some biology classes, human anatomy kind of classes for a little more detail there, but there's a couple sources. But we're going to jump from that biological sex to what we assume about people's biological sex. So the kind of attitudes, the characteristics, the feelings that we think any given person should have regarding their biological sex is kind of what we call gender. So it is this socially constructed idea of this is how this kind of person should behave based on what their apparent sex is. So, gender identity is that sense of your own gender. So, what is your understanding, your knowledge of it, your acceptance of being male, female, agender, gender fluid, gender queer, transgender? So, what is your own sense of your gender? Where do you fit in there? What do you understand about your gender? That is gender identity specifically. And then gender roles are really baked into this as well. We'll talk about them a lot as we go through the first part of this chapter. So, gender roles are kind of those expectations that we have for people of any given gender of how they should act or think or feel in any given situation. So, you might have some expectations that someone of this gender or this gender might be better or worse at any given activity. Maybe it's packing the back of a car before a trip, or making the lunches for the camping trip or something like that. Maybe you have some expectations or some gender roles of what you expect, who should do that, what kind of person would be better at doing that. And so that again, so gender is those characteristics, attitudes, and feelings that we as a culture kind of associate with a person's apparent biological sex. So you might not know what their actual biological sex is, right? And then also gender identity is your own internal sense of identity of around your gender. So what is your gender? Male, female, agender, gender fluid, gender queer, those kinds of things. And then gender roles, what do we expect for people to behave in specific ways based on what we assume their gender to be? All right, so now let's talk about how this develops over time. So, gender identity seems to be apparent to children earlier than 2 years old. So, when doing different studies, your book talks about this. It was linked to gender type play, suggesting that knowledge of gender categories, so these gender roles we expect, are already in kids' minds earlier than 2 years old. Again, when you're studying children at this age, you're not necessarily going to be able to ask them, so what is your gender, right? A lot of kids might not have even been exposed to any genders other than just boy and girl. So that might be all they've ever heard of, right? So, with that being said, they still have an internal sense of do they fit that? Do they not fit that? Are they some kind of mix or something outside of that gender binary? But it does seem like, even though we can't really ask really good in depth questions to see how they're processing it, that children will use gendered labels or do more gendered play. And so they're getting a sense of identity before age 2. So, with this being said, a lot of kids don't have the kind of words to describe their gender as anything other than male and female. There's a child that's close to my family that when they were very young, their parents would always use just like boy-girl language, so that these are the genders, boy and girl. And so there were times that this child would be asked about their gender, so like by someone in the surrounding environment, like sees them in a store. What's your name? Are you a boy or a girl? So this kind of question that you might ask a young child who's younger than two, and this child would often, pretty much always answer either I'm a girl boy or I'm a boy girl, putting those together rather than being boy or girl. Because again, that's what they had the context for. They didn't have the term, which later is who they are, is gender fluid. So, but they didn't have that term there. So, to the best of their knowledge, they expressed their gender very, very early on. And that's the case for a lot of people, is that they have a sense of their gender very early on in life as they're developing language that might be a little more clear. So to get a sense of that and the kinds of experiences and challenges that a lot of young people might get if they're not falling into the kind of expected gender boxes of boy and girl, let's watch the first part of this video. The whole video is pretty good, but we'll just watch the first part and try to take the perspective of the kindergartner in this story.
I have been a teacher for 15 years. 12 years ago, I had a student in my class whose name was Michael. We called him Mikey for short. By every indicator I had available to me, Mikey was a boy. Big green eyes, short curly hair, a sweet shy voice. He was adorable. He was also really smart, and he loved to draw. Sadly, Mikey had a hard time making friends and would often come to me at recess in tears. Socially, nothing seemed to go his way. Now fast forward 10 years. I was getting into my car after school one day, and I heard someone call my name. I looked up, and I saw this spunky young woman, tank top, short skirt, combat boots. She looked familiar, but I couldn't quite place her. "I'm Mikey," she said. "Well, you knew me as Mikey, but now my name is Mandy." My world shifted. I was shocked. Instantly, though, I recognized those big green eyes from kindergarten, and I reached out and hugged her. At that point, Mandy was a junior in high school and had, within the last few months, decided to live her life as a girl. But let me be clear, she didn't decide she was a girl. That she'd known for a long time. What she decided was to be and live in the world as her true self. Well, I asked Mandy why she hadn't thought of an easier moment to make the change, like going to college. She looked at me and said, "Batya, I could not wait one more day." When she recalled her years at elementary school, she remembered how much she hated going to the bathroom, the boys' bathroom. How every time teachers would put students in boys' lines and girls' lines, she hated it. I cringed when I thought how my boy-girl language reinforced a system where Mandy couldn't find a place for herself. Well, her story threw me for a loop. As a teacher, one of the most important things to me is that every child in my class feels safe. Well, determined to not make the same mistake again, I decided to get curious. I began to observe how gender was playing out in my classroom, and I did some research. And this is what I found. There are many myths and assumptions out there about gender, and they don't only hurt kids like Mandy, they hurt us all. So tonight I want to look at two main ones. The first myth is that gender is binary. What that means is we have two choices. We can either be masculine and male and feminine and female, nothing in between and nothing beyond. The second myth is that a person's sex and gender are the same thing, when in fact they're quite different. Sex is our biology. It's our anatomy. It's that moment at birth when someone lifts us up, looks between our legs, and declares, It's a boy. It's a girl. That is our assigned sex at birth. Now, here's something really interesting that I found out. 1 in 2,000 babies are born with genitals that don't conform to the gender boxes. That's more than 2 babies a day. Just that fact alone for me blew open the gender binary myth. Okay.
So the rest of this video goes into a little more detail on some of these points, but those are some of the main ones I wanted to get across. So the rest of the video is really good, and I definitely recommend you watch it. Some of the research is a little older now, but it's a pretty good video. And the main part there is I wanted you to get a sense of how these children are experiencing their lives. So how they are experiencing kindergarten, where people might assume to put in a boy or a girl's line, even if they're not able to communicate well that they are, say, gender fluid or trans. Right, so this can have impacts on the children. It also does impact kind of the gender roles that they're expecting and if they seem to fit that or not. Another piece there that was kind of alluded to is that difference between biological sex and gender. So again, they in the video talked a little bit about intersex people, so that's a good example there. There's a wide variety of fluidity in our biological sex, but there's also a lot of variety in gender as well. So that is what we will focus mostly on, is this gender identity over time. So again, it happens really early on. So a lot of people are pretty clear that what their gender is very early. If they don't have like examples of people who really fit their gender, it's definitely possible for them to kind of identify with a gender and then switch over to another one later as they're like, oh, actually this one fits a lot better. But with more discussion and talking about their kind of gender, it's a lot easier for them to see, oh, okay, yeah, this is where I fit. This is my identity. So again, going back to that definition for gender identity. So their own knowledge, their sense of being any given gender. So they're figuring that out very early on in life. So it's pretty quickly developed. All right, so with this, some of the biological influences on gender are some of the hormones that we have. So estrogens are a category of hormones that we define as a sex hormone, and these often influence females' physical sex characteristics and help regulate the menstrual cycle. But that being said, everybody has estrogens. So no matter what biological sex you have estrogens. Androgens as well. Everybody has androgens. So these are sex hormones that are primarily devoted to the male genitals and other secondary sex characteristics. And one example that you're probably familiar with that is an androgen is testosterone. So again, every single person has a variety of hormones, estrogens, androgens, a whole variety. And these are the ones that we see a kind of some clear differences. Again, not super clear. It's not clear cut. It's not always this way or always this way. There's a whole range of how hormones are in people's bodies. So with this, sex hormones alone don't dictate behavior. They don't dictate exactly what gender you're going to feel like as well. So a gene on the Y chromosome directs formation of testes, which secrete testosterone. So if you have more testosterone, you might have more aggressive behavior or heightened sexual behavior. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you will feel like any given gender. But it is a contributing piece of the puzzle. So social roles are another big piece of the puzzle. So psychological gender differences result from us having contrasting roles of women and men in society. So in a lot of cultures worldwide, women tend to have less power and less status than men, and they tend to control fewer resources. So the social role theory says that this kind of social hierarchy, this division of labor, leads to different expectations of gender, not because of actual innate biological or cognitive differences, but just because we see these are the roles being played out. So it is a social role to be male or masculine or female and feminine. And so because of that, we have differences in power, assertiveness, nurturing, and that if there were different social roles, we might see different behaviors in those from different genders. So this is similar and overlapping with the social cognitive theory of gender. And this is the idea that your gender development occurs as you are observing, imitating, making scripts and schemas about how different genders behave. Which one are you fitting in? What pieces of it do you not fit with? Another big thing is actual rewards and punishments for children for gender appropriate or inappropriate behavior. So, parents, teachers, culture, TVs, peers, all of these TVs and peers, TV like media that they are seeing and peers all perform these functions, whether to give them rewards for doing gender appropriate behavior or often punishments for doing gender inappropriate behavior. So that's part of this development that can influence how a child sees themselves and their gender identity over time. So gender schema is built from this. So we have a bunch of schemas in our brain. You can think of it as kind of a cognitive shortcut. So you have a idea of how things go. You probably have a schema of what happens when you get to a stoplight as you're driving in your car. You probably have a schema of what happens in a classroom in college. And based on that, your behavior will adjust or you'll have some expectations. If something happens outside of that norm, it might take some more cognitive energy to figure out, well, what is actually going on right now. So as an example, if you ever saw, say, an elementary school teacher on a hiking trail or in the store or something like that, it might have taken a minute to like place them because it's not fitting your preconceived like schemas and networks in your brain. So schemas in and of themselves can be really useful cognitively, help us process things faster, can be accurate, but also can be inaccurate. So with that, because of this social cognition, we start building these networks of associations of what genders should do in any given situation. And so it's overlapping with all these theories that we're talking about. So we often are motivated to conform to gender schemas. So getting rewards or punishments as we see us falling in line or not falling in line with the way the world is currently structured. So parental influence is one of the first ones here. So oftentimes parents give actions or examples, rewards or punishments to children. Another gender difference we see is that mothers are often more involved than fathers overall with all children. And then in many cultures, mothers are socializing their daughters to be more obedient and responsible. Again, it's possible that this person that the mother thinks is a daughter might actually not be a girl, right? That their gender identity might not quite fit that. But that is a pretty common thing that we see is socializing daughters to be more responsible and obedient. Fathers are generally paying more attention to their sons versus daughters. They're engaged more with sons, promoting sons' intellectual development, and just more involved there in that relationship. So again, a lot of this is going into the development of that gender identity over time. As they're seeing examples, as you see the different roles people play in life, but peers do this too. So as you're starting to say go into school, peers become increasingly more important. So rewarding or punishing gender behavior. So you might be teasing a boy who plays with a doll, girls getting called a tomboy. We see overall that the kind of gender roles and expectations for boys and men tend to have more punishments and rejections, so more peer rejection for gender nonconforming boys, even though it's not a great thing for gender nonconforming girls either, right? So we just see higher risk factors for gender nonconforming boys. So with this, at age 3, we often see that friend groups are becoming more same gender. Before that, oftentimes children will play with all genders, but as they start to grow, they're kind of splitting off into these social roles that they're seeing, and that stays pretty consistent through adolescence. So it is more exclusive as we go through ages 4 to 6. Boys often will play more sports, have more rough and tumble play, have higher conflict in their relationships. Girls tend to be more engaged in like collaborative discourse, reciprocal conversation, and that continues on into adolescence as well. Where at ages, let's say 12, or they've been spending more of their time with members of their own, and this says sex, gender would be a better word to put there. So with this, this is also based on gendered stereotypes. So these kind of schemas can lead to stereotypes, which are our general impressions or beliefs about females, males, or anyone who's another gender. And so this is present in the life of adolescents, adults, children. So gender stereotypes are something that we face every day. So with this, boys' gender stereotypes tend to be more rigid than girls' gender stereotypes, and that can also contribute to that increased peer rejection. And but these averages, these um, these gender similarities or differences that build these stereotypes, they're averages. They don't actually apply to every single female or every single male. Even when gender differences are measured, there's considerable overlap between males and females. So any of those differences that we see might be biological, but it also might be social, might be cultural. It's generally some combination of all of these. So as an example, this graph is in your book. So here we see visual spatial skills. And so this is one of the things that we see that males are higher on, visual spatial skills. But when you look at this graph, this is called a bell curve or normal distribution. So most people are falling in the middle, and then there's a few people who are very low in visual spatial skills, a few people very high, but most people are falling in here. So looking at these average scores, let's say you have, we won't go too much into stats, but let's pretend you have 2,000 males and 2,000 females. Right? That's a pretty big sample size to look for something like this. So you might find an average, and let's say, let's just make the math easy for me. Let's say the males are scoring a 5.1 as their visual spatial skills average. So the average of everybody, add up all the scores, divide it by the 2,000 males, and you get a 5.1. Then you do that for the females, you get a 5.0, right? Because these lines are basically the same. But that kind of result would be what we call statistically significant. We see a difference that we can say we're pretty certain that this difference is not from chance, that this is an actual difference. But again, you can see there's a ton of overlap here. So when we say these gender differences, a lot of these differences have a ton of overlap, just like this graph. So women do have twice the body fat of men. Males grow 10% larger than females. Females have a longer life expectancy. Males have higher stress hormones and higher blood pressure. Girls tend to be better at fine motor skills. Boys tend to be better at gross motor skills. The part of the hypothalamus for sexual behavior is larger in men. And then here's one of the facts that's related to this graphic. The parietal lobe for visual spatial skills is larger in men, again, on average. So all of these are on average. There's more activity in female areas of the brain for emotional expression. And female brains are 10% smaller than male brains, but they have more folds than male brains, so this for the same surface area. So for any of these points that we've been talking about, some of these might be biological, some of these might be social and cognitive. So if we look at this point, more activity in female areas of the brain for emotional expression. If you've been socialized your entire life that as a female, you should have more emotional responses, you should be more willing to share those emotions, well, yeah, your brain's going to be better at building a network to share emotions. But does that mean that females are actually better at emotions than men? Again, if you took a graph of it, I'm sure you would find it would look quite similar to this, that we might find some differences, right? So we also find there's no difference in intellectual ability, no difference in math scores. Girls score higher in reading and writing. Boys, again, score higher in visual spatial skills. So there are some statistically significant differences we are finding between different genders. But with that being said, well, one more slide, then I'll get to the main point around differences. So boys do tend to be more physically aggressive. Girls tend to use more verbal and relational aggression. Females are expressing more emotions. Boys are usually showing less self-regulation. So again, how much of these things are cultural, biological, social, and combinations? So when we talk about these similarities or these differences, do these differences matter? Look at the difference here between males and females on visual spatial skills. While we can find a statistically significant difference between the two groups, you'd definitely be very accurate to say there is considerable overlap. The actual description under the picture says they almost entirely overlap. So you might be a female over here with high visual spatial skills or a male over here with lower visual spatial skills. But honestly, for any given person, your gender is not very predictive of your visual spatial skills. So do these differences matter? It depends. So with that being said, gender differences that we've seen in the past may be greatly exaggerated. So the largest differences we see are in motor skills, sexuality, and aggression, but contexts are also very important. The social context that a person has developed in and grown over time. I have these pictures of Supergirl and Wonder Woman here because we can kind of take an example of very different cultures. But let's talk about traditional gender roles and expectations often guide expectations, right? An expectation to raise a girl to, say, be more nurturing, or raise a boy to be more directly confrontational, maybe. The display of emotion and helping behavior is very culturally dependent. Different cultures will or will not help in specific situations. As one quick example of that, in the US, we see it as less pro-social, less good of a person if we are asked to help and then we help. It's considered better for us in the US to help without being asked. So do that pro-social behavior without being asked. But that's not the case in a lot of other countries. In China and Japan, for example, you could help and without being asked, see something is needed, see someone needs help, and you can help. But it's actually considered a bigger or better thing to do help when you are asked to help. So because you know what the person needs, and that's a cultural difference. So that display of helping behavior is culturally dependent. We'll go into things like gender identity as well as your identity in general. So we do see Western cultures are a little more flexible and allow a little more diversity in gender today. But I have these funny pictures here because these are fictional examples, right? Supergirl comes from another planet. So what would the gender expectations be there on another planet? So I mean, it really depends which comics or which movie you're watching or show. But essentially, there was a lot of similarities between the genders in a lot of the depictions of Krypton. So rather than distinctions and differences, Amazonians are a fighting and warrior culture, right? So they have a specific cultural upbringing that leads them to be more aggressive, stronger than other people. I mean, there's magic and comic stuff involved in this too. But it's just maybe to get your idea on, yeah, context and how a person develops over time is important for their gender identity. So hopefully that helps you see how a lot of these differences, one, tend not to be as big as we previously thought, and two, maybe less just some ingrained thing in any given specific gender. It's probably some big combination of social factors, cultural factors, biological factors, epigenetic factors, a whole big complicated thing that leads to gender development. All right, so in short, there are small differences that we can see between genders, but many of these differences between the genders are not actually biological. A lot of them have a little bit of biological component, but then also have social and cultural components, so that these differences may not be as dramatic or important as we previously thought. So this was a paper that was discussed in your book. I think it's really good. Feel free to look it up. You should know how to find research at this point in class that you're watching this. So definitely look up this paper and another one that I'll show in a minute. But I just wanted to point out the abstract here. So the differences model argues that females and males have vastly different psychology, and that dominates popular media. The author here advances a different view, the gender similarities hypothesis, which holds that the males and females are similar on most but not all psychological variables. So what they did is a meta-analysis, and so that's essentially a study of studies, if you remember back to methods. So they're looking at how big the differences are, take 46 studies, put all the data together, see what the actual differences are, and find that gender differences can vary substantially in magnitude at different ages, depending on the context in which the measurement occurs. Overinflated claims of gender differences carry substantial costs in areas such as the workplace and relationships. So essentially, they looked at all these studies, put all the data together, and saw, oh, the differences are not as big of differences as we previously thought. There's a lot more similarity between different genders than we previously thought there were. So, with that being said, your book has a section about moving beyond the gender binary. And so, this is some evidence coming from many, many fields, not just psychology, not just biology, but neuroscience research shows that a gender mosaic is in our brains. So, there's no his or her brains, but that brains are diverse from one another, that we might see some trends or patterns, but that there's actually a lot more variation in our brains than we previously thought. So, endocrinology research also shows that there are more hormone similarities in males and females than we previously thought. So, again, better measurement tools, better methods have shown there's a lot more similarities in our hormones than we previously realized. Now, also, we have a bunch of new gender categories that have names. So, transgender versus cisgender and others. So, psychology is added to this as well. And developmental research, both biology, neurology, psychology, medicine, shows that culture really strongly influences the tendency to see gender as binary or not. So, gender categories are quite fluid, and having a gender binary is not as scientifically accurate as we previously had thought that it was. So, with this can lead to changes in how we see and interact with people in childhood, across cultures, as we develop over time. So, with this, jumping to another paper, and hopefully my face isn't covering all of this, but the title here, Future of Sex and Gender in Psychology, 5 Challenges to the Gender Binary. Again, just to focus on the abstract here. So, gender binary is often used in a lot of studies. If you look back at the methods of medical research, neuroscience research, psychology research, one of the things asked would be, what is your sex or what is your gender? Oftentimes those were used interchangeably, but using just male, female. More recently, you might see male, female, other. There's a bigger push to get a lot better research on differences across the different genders, so including more genders. Um, I forget how many categories I included in my dissertation. I think it was 9, for example, and then a space to say, well, if I haven't actually included it, put it here. So we can get a better sense of what the variety of humans actually is. So, with this talks about in recent years, gender binary challenges have risen from academia and social activism. So, with this, a lot of the findings from multiple disciplines undermine that gender binary idea. So, neuroscience, we've got neuroendocrinology that we just mentioned, with the hormone systems, psych research on transgender and non binary individuals. So, all of these come to the fact that and that the tendency to view gender and sex as a meaningful binary category is really a cultural decision that we've made over time, and it is malleable. So, and with this, we have some costs that we can see with having this kind of gender binary. So, if you want more detail on gender development over time, that would be a really great place to start. Are those 2 papers that are talked about in your book. Also, some of those videos if you want to go into the biology of sex. But yeah, gender identity develops very early on in life, before age 2. Again, you might not have the words to describe exactly how you're feeling and where you fit there. But hopefully, you've got a much clearer idea of what we actually know about the science behind gender today. So with this, jumping all the way into late adulthood, because once you kind of have that set early on in childhood, there is some degree of fluidity, right? Some people are going to be more fluid in their genders than others. Some people take the gender identity of gender fluid because of how fluid they are in their genders. But it is a lot more fluid than you might previously have thought based on all of the research that we have seen. So, with this, we also see some evidence that gender roles decrease in late adulthood as well. There's a lot of less distinction between femininity and masculinity, or feminine and masculine roles and tasks as we get into late adulthood. Older men do tend to become more nurturing on average. Late adults are faced with both ageism and sexism, which can be a really big challenge. But we see that for a lot of late adults, it's not as big of a thing in their social roles on average again. So you might think of your own particular grandma or grandpa and say, oh, that doesn't fit my family. This again is overall on average. We see a lot less distinction between masculine or feminine traits, tasks, and roles as we get into late adulthood. Now, we are going to switch topics to talking from gender development to talking about sexuality development. So the book kind of puts these together in one chapter. With how much material that we cover, I think it makes sense to be as one chapter, but this is kind of like switching to a new chapter. These are related, right? Everything that we talk about in lifespan development is related to everything else, but I do think it does a little bit of a disservice to put gender and then sexuality right after, because they are not 100% like one jumps to the other one. So gender and sexuality, two different things. We're switching now to sexuality development over the lifespan. We'll start in childhood. A lot of children do engage in some sex play with friends or even siblings, so this often involves things like exhibiting or inspecting genitals, and usually this is just curiosity, wondering about other people, about other bodies. With that being said, that curiosity does remain high throughout elementary school and into middle school. Oftentimes, children in early, middle, late childhood will talk about sexuality, ask about it, ask questions about these kinds of things. And one thing that we see is really helpful as we get into our chapters on parenting and how to do things like parenting, you shouldn't have just one single the talk, right? There shouldn't be like that. So these kinds of questions make for a really good time to be able to discuss bodies early on in childhood, relationships, sexual behaviors as children are growing up. So it shouldn't be just a one big scary the talk that children or adolescents are getting. It should be a open line of communication about things in human development over the lifespan. So when these kinds of things happen, if these kinds of things happen, this kind of inspecting or exhibiting genitals to friends, for example, is something to be, say, discussed. It's something to talk about. And if they're curious about bodies, anatomy books, for example, could be a really good place to go to show some examples of different people's bodies and to, again, developmentally appropriate. So you wouldn't necessarily show the same thing to, say, a 4-year-old that you would say to a 14-year-old, as an example. So, as we grow up, we are more and more interested in what sexuality looks like. And in adolescence and early adulthood, this is where the majority of the research on human sexuality is. So, adolescent sexuality is a really normal part of human development. It's important for building things like relationships, it's important for things like interacting with peers. So there are a ton of research that has covered adolescent sexuality. Most of the time, it focuses on some of the kind of risk factors that we don't want to have happen, like early pregnancy, STIs, STDs. And so adolescents often are looked at negatively in terms of sexuality. And so there's like negative stereotypes around adolescence and sex and sexual behaviors. It's kind of an interesting thing cross-culturally that all societies are really attentive to or concerned with adolescent sexuality. So even though the parents were once adolescents and were concerned with sexuality in adolescence, now as parents, they're very worried about the adolescent children or maybe even their grandchildren who are adolescents and having sex or anything in regards to sexuality. So it's a really funny thing that is cross-cultural that a lot of people of the earlier generations, even though they were adolescents, are really worried about the adolescent sexuality. With this being said, it's a time in adolescence of sexual exploration, experimentation. Oftentimes, sexual fantasies are present, and these might, in some cases, become realities or actually seeing the reality of how sex works, incorporating sexuality into your identity as well. So, depending on the chapters that you're going through, we probably have already, or we'll be very soon talking about identity development overall. So, sexual identity, gender identity, those are all incorporated into what we call in adolescence, or usually it's closer to early adulthood, identity, where that first time it's stable for long enough that we kind of call it now an identity. And so, these are some pieces that build into that as adolescents are trying to figure themselves out. So, in the US at least, most adolescents are learning a lot about sex from the media. So, from things like shows, internet, whatever it might be. Sexting is also a behavior that we see on the rise in adolescence. So, that can be something that, again, could be discussed by um, doctors, parents, mentors, that kind of thing, about how to be safe and not sharing too much information with people or what kinds of things you should be sharing. So with it, this is also time as they're trying things out to learn to manage sexual feelings like arousal and attraction. There are times when it would be appropriate to demonstrate those sexual feelings, and there's times that it's completely inappropriate to demonstrate those sexual feelings. So getting some practice on learning those kinds of social expectations and roles is a good thing as well. Also, adolescents, as they are, again, depending on where we are in the chapters, what order, you've probably already learned about adolescent dating over time. So that oftentimes earlier on in adolescence, big group hangouts, not necessarily splitting off. Crush might not even know that they're a crush, to moving to some kind of group dates, maybe some pairing off, but then later into adolescence, closer to 17, 18, that we have splitting off into couples, that kind of thing. And in that kind of case, it often uh, follows this pattern of sexual behavior. So it's a lot more common to have adolescents who have had sex when they're 17, 18 versus, say, 14, a lot less common. So, with this, sexual identity is also influenced by social norms that are related to sex. And so, developing these sexual identities is more than just sexual feelings and attraction. So, this is also about what kind of intimacy should we have with a partner, for example. Again, depending on where you've gone in the chapters at this point, intimacy in this kind of context is we are talking about like sharing things with other people. So, what are my deep desires and interests and things that I hope happens in my future? What are the things you hope happens in your future? The things that you care about a lot. That's the kind of intimacy we're talking about here. But also sexual behavior regulation, and with that, we also see a lot of physical factors. So in adolescence, a lot of people are going through puberty, partway through, finishing up near the end of adolescence for some people. Also social factors. What are the peers doing? What are the peers saying that they are doing? So what's the frequency of sex? Are they using protection? Are they not using protection? What does the culture say about having sex with any given partner? What about sexual orientation? So all of these go into an adolescent as they're developing their sexual identity and their ideas around sex and sexual behavior. But this is a pretty tough thing to study in adolescence. One of the main reasons that it's hard to study in adolescence is adolescents lie a lot about their sexual behavior, drug use behavior. Those are two of the most common things for adolescents to lie about. They might say they're sexually active when they're actually not, because they think they might, that peers might be interested in that, even when a survey or a study is completely anonymous and they are told like nobody else is going to see these results. Oftentimes they will lie, say that they are having protected sex, even if they're not, or that they aren't, even if they are. So it goes a lot into kind of those social roles and expectations. So people are usually people that volunteer for a study that includes sexuality as a behavior generally also have more liberal sexual attitudes to begin with. So you might also be getting a skewed population. If it's one piece of a larger study, sometimes you can get a little more accurate data there. But yeah, adolescents lie, so it's sometimes difficult to study adolescent sexuality. That being said, there are tricks and tools that we can use methodologically to try and figure out when people are lying. And also, if we're looking at overall trends, if we're getting good samples, enough people not lying, we should hopefully get some pretty good trends. One kind of no, that's a little too far on tangents for a different specific kind of research method about adolescents lying about sexual behavior. Take a research methods class and you'll hear that anecdote of a bunch of people who just totally lied to the researcher. And the researcher published that work for years and years. Anyway, point is, next slide here. So the ages of sexual initiation really vary across ethnicities and across different cultures across the world as well. So we see that Black adolescents tend to engage in sex earlier. Asian American adolescents tend to engage in sex later. About 31% of female adolescents who had vaginal sex first reported teen pregnancy versus about 8% who first had oral genital sex. They were less likely to report teen pregnancy. So this is an interesting thing about sexual development is a lot of our sexual desires are also closely tied to hormones, for example. And so these hormones and our bodies in general, because of evolution over time, want to pass on genetic material to another generation. So the cycle, a menstrual cycle, for example, and the ovulation cycle, oftentimes hormones that are heightened at the time when a woman is ovulating make it so they are more likely to take sexual risks, even if previously they hadn't planned to. So let's just say that it is the night of a maybe just a date night. Let's say it's just a simple date night. This girl and guy had talked about and not planned on having sex yet. They'd already discussed this before, but it just so happens that the girl is also ovulating on this evening, and so her sexual desires are heightened. The guy's sexual desires might also be heightened, right, based on their being alone or not alone. Maybe they're a little more likely to have sex since they hadn't been planning on this. They don't have protection with them, and so they're now pregnant. It's a pretty common example of what happens. Again, for an adolescent, their prefrontal cortex, it's harder to run through that. It's a lot easier to run through the emotional centers of the brain. You've got those hormones going. That's why for a lot of adolescents, their first sexual experience might lead. So it's a pretty common occurrence for a first sexual experience for one to lead to pregnancy because it happens to coincide with a time when she's ovulating, and it's very easy to get pregnant, or a lot easier to get pregnant over those couple days versus the rest of the month if that had been when they had sex unprotected. That being said, it's another good reason to talk about safe sex practices. Have a plan in place, have a backup plan in place. So even if they had discussed not having sex, still having protection in case that was something like that occurs. Those hormones, as well as that risk-taking behavior. So it is an unfortunate occurrence that we see a lot of early pregnancies because of that were unplanned. It's a pretty common thing. This being said, this goes into our risk factors. Again, most of the research on adolescent sexuality is on the risk factors. A lot of adolescents aren't emotionally prepared to handle a lot of sexual experiences and the building up of relationships around that. Again, that's why we try to encourage adolescents to delay their first sexual interactions till closer to, say, 17, 18. So early adolescence, we see the higher risk factors. As they get further on into adolescence, we see less of those risk factors being a case. But early sexual experiences, so before the age of 14, we see a lot more adolescents who are using drugs, have more delinquency and school problems. We also see a lot more sexual assault and rape in these kinds of cases of early sexual experience. We see less condom use, higher pregnancy. We also see that being low SES and in the inner city is a risk factor for these early sexual experiences as well. Another thing that we've talked about in the chapters as well as early maturing girls are at a higher risk of early sexual experience too, oftentimes from older partners. So with this, we see some risk factors in family context as well. So parent hostility, so in the home, is correlated with early sexual activity and having multiple partners. Older siblings who are sexually active, that is another risk factor for early sexual activity. And single parent homes, especially for girls, is also a risk factor. So some of these are obviously correlational. Some of these might have some causal relationships. So with this, we also have some research on protective factors. So, protective factors for adolescent sexuality are parental warmth and support. So, with this, family connectedness, so family being able to be themselves around each other to communicate with one another, parent adolescent communication, specifically about sexuality, but also parent communication overall is a protective factor. And parent monitoring, which we've alluded to a few times in different chapters, but parent monitoring basically means that a parent, especially in adolescence, is giving the adolescent a lot of freedom. If you're an authoritative parent, you probably have some restrictions and rules, curfews, for example, but that the parent also knows like this is where the kid is or where the teen is. This is the friends that they're with. These are the kinds of things they're doing in general, not necessarily like a helicopter parent, like right over them, dictating exactly everything they're doing. Parent monitoring is a little bit more step back, let the adolescent have a little bit more freedom. And if you are connected as a family, if you are communicating, you can maybe catch some of these potential risk factors before they happen. So, like I said, it's a very important thing to be actively discussing sex, sexuality, bodies, just in general, so that it doesn't have to be the talk about sex. As this adolescent is, say, 17, might be too late at that point. So another couple things. So positive school climate. So having a climate where in the school they feel like they can be themselves. They feel like it's a safe place. Students with high academic achievement are usually not having sex early on as well. So these early risky sexual behaviors. Higher self-regulation is correlated with later sexual behaviors. Internalized pro-social norms and spirituality, interestingly, are correlated to later onset of sexual behaviors as well. So with this, the main reason there's a lot of reasons that adults are concerned with the adolescents and their sexual behaviors and really worried about that. But one thing is that we're worried about unintended pregnancies. It's a really big responsibility to have a child. And so we see also that in the US, we have 6 times more adolescent pregnancies than in the Netherlands with similar development, similar-ish access to healthcare. But interestingly, versus the Netherlands, the rates of sexual activity aren't significantly different. So, about the same number of adolescents are having sex at about the same time in their lifespan, but they're getting a lot more pregnant a lot more often here in the US. We have seen lowering of teen pregnancy rates, especially since 2010, but it still is a lot higher than other developed countries that are similar to us in a lot of ways. So here are some of the declines we've seen since 2010, which is good. Seeing this kind of drop is really nice. The dotted black line is the average for all these ethnic groups that are split up by the different colored lines. So good trajectory, still could be quite a bit better. So why do we have such high rates of adolescent pregnancy? Well, in other countries, child rearing is often seen as an exclusively adult activity. In a lot of other cultures and countries, there are a lot of clear messages about sexual behavior, both that it is inappropriate, expected, even in adolescence, versus having it be kind of like a stigma around adolescent sexual behaviors or even demonized, a lot more access to family planning services. So if you don't know where to get, you don't feel comfortable going into a store and buying a condom, having access to that in some easier way can really help. So we see adolescent pregnancy sets a person up for a lot more risk factors later in life. It sets that child up for a lot of risk factors too. So we see higher risk for preterm and low birth weights, which if you remember back to the beginning of biology chapters, that sets you up for a bunch of other risk factors down the line. Higher mother depression, higher school dropout, and this is a combined risk factor if you add in low SES adolescent parents. So this is something that we do want to help prevent. and educate so it doesn't happen. Because again, adolescent sexual behaviors is a normative part of human development. It's something that we should expect and maybe change some of the culture around it as well so that young people know that they can be safe with their sexual practices. So, with that being said, there's a lot of research on what is the best way to do that. And we've found that comprehensive sex education, or what is kind of under the umbrella term comprehensive sex education, is the best way to give sex education across the lifespan. And so, depending on the class, this video will be inserted right here, these first two links of what is comprehensive sex education and what it looks like at different ages. Or you might have this as an activity as well. So just follow your instructions for that. That being said, comprehensive sex education is trying to be very comprehensive. That's why it's got the name comprehensive. So it's talking about things like anatomy, biology, how pregnancy happens, things like forms of contraception, STIs. So with that, this is in comparison to other types of sex education. Abstinence-only sex education is still the norm in a lot of states in the United States, which encourages adolescents to just not have sex, and that doesn't work. So as we saw in some of these stats, that by age 18, about 50 to 60% of adolescents have had sex. So, with that being said, comprehensive sex education starts basically as soon as school starts. And you'll see at the how CSE looks at different ages that when it starts, you're really talking about building strong relationships with people. Things like empathy, things like respecting people's boundaries, things like communicating with people, and you kind of build on that. You can also talk about body parts and anatomy, especially if you're parents or nurses and doctors of these children. But you're not actually talking to a kindergartner or a first grader about how to use a condom. You wouldn't do that until they're closer to the age that they might actually be needing to use a condom. But these kind of relationship building skills are very essential for once we enter into sexual relationships later on. Knowing how to talk about our wants and needs, being able to say no, what should we expect, what should we do if someone is not respecting those boundaries. Those are things that you can start off very early. So in short, these are things that are part of comprehensive sex education, even though you might not think of them as directly being tied to sex education. And that's really where we start with these skills and these communication abilities that later on are funneling into having healthy sexual relationships in adolescence and adulthood. So, with this access to contraceptive methods, having community involvement and support, having a culture of that adolescent sexual behavior is a norm and it's not so stigmatized, can really help with reducing adolescent pregnancy as well. So again, if this is coming from parents in consistent communications, so rather than just the talk, having discussions across the lifespan, being open to talking about things, whether it be anatomy and when children are curious about that earlier on in childhood, to how to navigate relationships and be respectful of people, be responsible, and then later on, what actually happens during sex and how to be safe during sex. These are things that are hopefully open communications and not just one single the talk that everybody's kind of nervous and uncomfortable for, because these kinds of discussions have always been going on. The next main topic to focus on is patterns of sexual development in sexual minority adolescents and adults. So, sexual orientation is really the direction of your emotional, romantic, and erotic interest, and that's simply what it is. So, who is that directed towards? What gender is that directed towards? That's your sexual orientation. So with this, usually this attraction to same sex or behavior around same sex is happening earlier in life, but identifying as LGBTQ plus usually is occurring in adolescence. You might see crushes in childhood. Again, that's when crushes are appearing for a lot of people in childhood. But this kind of follows the pattern of dating that we've talked about in adolescence, or maybe we'll talk about, depending on the chapters you're on. There's kind of a pattern where say from 12 to 14 or even into childhood, usually young people are in groups. So they're not really splitting off. They might have crushes, but the crush might not even know that the other person is interested in them. They might never have any kind of one-on-one interactions, but they are developing those kind of attractions to one another. Then from about 14 to 16, we see some splitting off, more like group things where you're in a group still, you're in a with a bunch of people hanging out, but you know that like these people are a couple. Right? And then as you get closer to 17, 18, we see relationships that look remarkably similar to adult relationships, with people splitting off, pairing off, and dating and having even multi-year relationships. And so with that, this kind of also follows the pattern for LGBTQ plus adolescents. So they might have those crushes early on. Oftentimes we don't see that dating behavior until a little bit later. Oftentimes we see more sexual behavior rather than splitting off and dating earlier on. And most of that's just down to having a smaller dating pool. So with that, what is the total percentage of LGBTQ plus people in the world? Well, somewhere between 3 and 20% probably. It really depends on the study, where they're looking at, what ages they're looking at. There is still a lot of stigma worldwide around being LGBTQ plus. So with this, the more reliable studies do show closer to something around 10%. But with that being said, when we're looking at numbers in the US for Gen Z, we're seeing closer to 15 and even 20% or higher. So it does make me suspect that if we had zero stigma, this number would probably be somewhere between 10 and 20% based on the statistics that we have right now. So it is a sizable number of people, but that also might be just a smaller dating pool in, say, your high school. It's a lot easier for people who are LGBTQ plus to find dating partners as they move out of the house, as they're starting college, starting their jobs, these kinds of things. So we usually see that's a slight difference, is a lot more dating relationships after high school time. So with this, we see that sexual orientation, uh, researchers have investigated genetics, biology, cognitive factors, and environmental and social factors. And in short, all of those are some of the guiding forces for sexual orientation for everybody. So not only people who are LGBTQ plus, but people who are heterosexual as well. Genetics, biology, your hormones, your brain chemistry, your cognitive factors, your environmental and social factors, and people that you've had experience with or crushes on, all of these things go into developing your sexual orientation over time. So hormones might have some critical periods in the womb, so prenatally, so in between the second and fifth month after conception. A kind of funny, sad and funny story is when one attempt to try and cure gay men of being gay was to suggest that, well, maybe they just don't have enough testosterone. Maybe they're too effeminate. So maybe if we just give them more testosterone, maybe they will not be gay anymore. So if you remember from the beginning of this lecture, testosterone, one of the things it does quite a few things as a hormone in the body. All hormones do. But one of the things it does is increase desire for sexual behavior. So it increases the desire for these men's sexual behavior. So it had, you might say, the opposite effect that the original researchers intended it to, which is sad that that was an attempt to try and stop them from being gay, but it is really funny in how spectacularly it failed as well. So with that, we do see testosterone is very related to wanting more sexual behavior. Another thing that we see is genetics are a component to sexual orientation. So when we look at people who are gay, about 35% of the variation in men and about 19% of the variation in women can be attributed to genetics. So putting that in another way, let's say you have two twins, one is gay, about 35% of the time the other twin is also gay. So it's not a 100% genetic thing, it's a combination of factors, which shouldn't be surprising at this point in time in the lifespan development class. Every single piece of development is affected by a lot of other systems in the body, in the brain, in our social emotional interactions. Same thing for sexual orientation. So with this, many times attraction starts in a childhood. So for a lot of people, they'll start getting crushes in childhood. This is also true for people who are attracted to the same sex or multiple genders. So with this, they might, depending on your sociocultural context, you might not even consider that attraction to a same-sex person. So you might start this attraction in adolescence and be more abrupt. You might not realize it until you are later on in life. And that being said as well, sexual orientation is not set and fixed for everybody across their entire lifespan. So it is also very possible for someone to develop a different sexual orientation or for it to shift and move throughout the lifespan. But the common thing that we see is an attraction early on in childhood, which develops over time, as with any sexual orientation. So, with this early reinforcement or experience with the same versus opposite gender can foster or hinder attractions. So, again, all of these are kind of pieces of the puzzle to develop your sexual orientation or any given person's sexual orientation. So with this is maybe a lot more variables than you realized went into sexual orientation. So let's watch a video about a researcher who investigates sexual orientation and has a couple interesting longitudinal stories. We won't watch the whole video, but if you want to watch the whole video, it's pretty good overall. But the main part that we're interested in is the first kind of third of this video.
True or false? Sexual orientation is something you're born with. Chances are that if you support LGBT rights, you said true. Surveys have found that people who view sexual orientation as an innate trait, like eye color, tend to be more supportive of LGBT rights. Now, why is that? When asked, folks typically say, well, it's just wrong to discriminate against someone for how they're born. It's like ethnic discrimination. Makes sense. So for years, the born that way argument has been used to promote LGBT equality. Lady Gaga's song, Born That Way, even became an unofficial anthem of the gay community. But there are three problems with the Born That Way argument. First, it's not scientifically accurate. Second, it's not legally necessary. But third, and most important, it's actually unjust. And it's time to retire that argument for LGBT equality. Now, my passion for this issue stems from my own research on sexual orientation. Over 20 years ago, I started a study tracking over time 100 women with different sexual identities. And over the years, I was frankly surprised by some of the changes that they went through. Some of the lesbians ended up involved with men. Some of the heterosexual women ended up getting involved with women. And when these sorts of things would happen, women would say to me that they thought there must be something wrong with them, since their experiences didn't fit the conventional wisdom that sexual orientation is fixed at birth. So that brings us to the first problem with the Born That Way argument, that it's not scientifically accurate. Now, sexual orientation does often express itself very early and very consistently, but lots of times it doesn't. And it breaks my heart when I hear people express distrust of LGBT individuals who came out late in life, for example, after a heterosexual marriage. People will say things like, how could they not have known all this time? Are they sure that they're really gay? Just imagine how it feels to hear that from someone that you just came out to. But the plain truth is that gender and sexual development show a lot more variability than most people realize. And that variability often leads to change over time in sexual attractions. National and international studies conducted by researchers at Cornell, the Harvard School of Public Health, the University of Virginia, and many others have collectively tracked tens of thousands of individuals for 5, 10, 15 years. And guess what? sexual attractions show a fair amount of fluidity. Some individuals start out exclusively attracted to one gender, and over time they find themselves attracted to both genders, or vice versa. Some bisexual individuals shift from being more drawn to one gender to being more drawn to the other. Now, what does this fluidity tell us about the innateness of sexual orientation? Nothing. Nothing at all, because they're completely unrelated. There is, to be sure, strong evidence for genetic contributions to sexual orientation, but those contributions do not cement your entire sexual lifespan from birth. What they do is push its development in a certain direction. If sexuality were totally locked down by genes, well, then if you had two identical twins and one twin was gay, the other twin would be gay 100% of the time because they have the same genes. But in reality, twin studies have found that if you have two identical twins and one twin is gay, the other twin is gay 30 to 40% of the time. Now, that is way higher than you would expect by chance alone, so it is definite evidence that your genes influence your sexual orientation. But your genes do not provide the last word on every sexual feeling you're ever going to have. Now, before moving on, I want to make one thing crystal clear. The fact that sexuality can be fluid does not mean that therapists can cure individuals of same-sex attractions. That's sometimes called conversion therapy, and study after study has shown that it does not work, and it does immense psychological damage, increasing rates of depression, anxiety, suicide attempts. That's why conversion therapy has been discredited by all of these major medical and psychological associations, and it's why all of these former practitioners of conversion therapy have not only shut their own doors, but have publicly apologized to the LGBT community and have joined legal efforts to ban the use of conversion therapy with children and adolescents. Absolutely. So, let there be no misunderstanding. Although sexual attractions may fluctuate on their own, trying to forcibly eliminate same-sex attractions is ineffective, harmful, and unethical, period.
So one of the main points in that video, and feel free to watch the rest of it, it is really good, but it goes into like legal arguments and things around supporting people who are LGBTQ+, so not as relevant for this section of the class when we're talking about the development of sexuality. But one thing that they mentioned there was the push or pull based on these factors. So we've talked about a variety of factors: socio-emotional factors, genetic, hormone factors, environmental factors, your context and culture. And each of these things is pushing or pulling your sexual orientation over the development of your lifespan. So we might have, say, like this developmental cascades model, a drop of water that, let's say this is a particular sexual orientation, right? So it can be any that you choose. Could be heterosexual, could be someone who's gay, could be someone who's a lesbian. Oh, too far. So here we've got that sexual orientation. It's possible for that water droplet to consistently basically take this same path all the way around. Maybe not with this example. It looks like the river does kind of go this way. But you could take a Plinko bottle and just bounce this way. Just the same way. Be consistent over your entire lifespan. But that is not the case for everybody. Someone might be attracted to one gender and then attracted to another gender and then attracted to another gender again later on in their lifespan. So there is fluidity. These different forces that we're talking about, whether they're genetic, environmental, socio-emotional, all of these help with that kind of push and pull as you develop and change over time. Remember, development is change over time. And what we see is that with both gender, with also sexual orientation, there's a lot more change over time than we previously thought when we look at all of the science and all of the fields that are investigating this topic. So, with that being said, thinking about this developmental cascades model, sexual orientation is not influenced by being reared by a gay parent, parenting styles specifically, or childhood sexual experimentation. All of these things are not highly correlated with sexual orientation. So, genetics, hormones, psychological, and sociological factors are the main influences of sexual orientation. And again, it may be fixed for one person, it may not be fixed for another person. So, these things have some fluidity and change over time. So, let's jump forward to early adulthood. By early adulthood, so that 18 to say 25 point of time, about 60% of individuals have experienced sexual intercourse by that time. And we also know the average marriage age in the US is 30 for males and 28 for females. And so essentially, this means that a lot of early adults are sexually active and not married. This is a common pattern. With that, we see casual sex with friends, or casual sex and friends with benefits are really increasing relationship styles. So this is often also correlated with risky sexual behavior. So this is something that's being investigated of how can we help people who are adults be safer with sex as well. But again, most of the research is on adolescents. There's a lot more concern about the risky sexual behavior of adolescents versus when it's adults. It is a concern because some of these health complications can follow them their entire life. So safe sex practices are important, and some of the same things like comprehensive sex education early in life can prevent some of these problems in early adulthood as well. So jumping forward, another piece that's a part of the sexual hormones is menopause and perimenopause. And I should probably shift these around. But all adults have fertility decline over time. For females, we see perimenopause being a transition period from that normal menstrual period to no menstrual periods. And that for some can take up to 10 years. It might be shorter for some people, though. So with this hormone change is about as dramatic as the changes that are happening in puberty. And so, with that being said, um, generally people who are at this age, so in their 40s, for example, have had many years to run through their prefrontal cortex, regulate their emotions. And so, you often don't see as many dramatic external changes from the person because they have better self-regulation now than they did when they were in going through puberty, but it is a similar dramatic change of the hormones in the body. Then at menopause, so that's the point where the menstrual periods cease. This usually happens in the late 40s or early 50s for people. So with that being said, hormone replacement therapy is a pretty commonly prescribed treatment for this. So this augments any of those declining hormone levels. So you can measure like exactly what your hormones are. What do we see as we come back to an appointment 6 months later or a year later? What has changed? Maybe we can augment some of these hormones to reduce some of the changes, dramatic effects that are happening really quickly and could lead to negative side effects and things like that. That being said, hormone replacement therapy does have increased risk of breast cancer, but alternatives like exercise, other dietary supplements, relaxation, and other non-steroid medications can help as well. So talking to a doctor about treatments and what to do during the process of perimenopause is really very useful. So with that, most men do not lose the capacity to have children over the lifespan. It just become a little more difficult, some of the components of having sex. So we do see testosterone production and sperm count decline slowly over the lifespan. We also do generally see sex drive reducing over adulthood. And then as we go further along in middle to late adulthood, we see erections are also less frequent and less full. This can also be exacerbated or even caused by things like depression, stress, high cholesterol, and these kinds of things. So with that being said, the reason I have this picture of the car sponsored by Viagra is because erectile dysfunction is very common in aging men. I've got a kind of funny story about this. When I was in undergrad, I was a freshman and I took a job in the city that I was living in doing phone surveys. Essentially, I would be the annoying person on the other end of the phone who would call people to ask if they would participate in a survey about something. Different companies basically hired our company to get assessments of their products, services, shows that you'd watch, things like that. One of them was Viagra. And lucky me, I was put on the Viagra survey for almost every day for about 3 months, every working day anyway. So it's kind of a funny thing. We would call up, we had essentially a list of men who were in between the ages of 35 and 45. So keep that in mind. These men were in between 35 and 45. And we would call them, I mean, the robot computer would call them. And then once someone picked up, I got the call. I would say, "Hi, I'm from whatever the company was I was working at. We're calling to ask some questions about sports. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" And so when people said yes, my first question would be, "I'm going to read a list of sports. Would you tell me which of these sports you were interested in?" One of them was NASCAR, as you can kind of guess where we might be going with this. Another one was baseball. There was a specific athlete who was sponsored also by Viagra in baseball. So if you were asked, if you said you were interested in baseball or NASCAR, um, we would get to the next question, and that was, "Are you familiar with the Mark Martin #6 car?" They would pretty much always say yes. And I would say, "Do you know one of the sponsors of that car?" And they would always say Viagra because clearly it's sponsored by Viagra. So this is like the fourth or fifth question that I've asked participants, like these strangers somewhere in the US that I don't know. I'm like 19 years old talking to these people that are my current age, 35 to 45. And so the next question that I asked these complete strangers on the phone was, "Do you have occasional or frequent difficulty in achieving or maintaining an erection?" Asking that to a stranger. And so every single one of them always said yes. So I never had a participant say no. I also didn't have participants say, "Oh, I'm so upset. Why are you talking to me about this? Go away. Don't talk to me." Everybody said yes, and I continued asking questions about what kinds of things they had tried for their erectile dysfunction. Had they tried Viagra? How successful was it? This kind of thing. Yeah, I would call up strangers for my job and ask them if they had frequent or occasional difficulty in achieving or maintaining an erection. So hopefully that gives you some sense of the adult sexual development. Literally every single one of those 35 to 45-year-olds all said yes, that they had that problem. Um, and I think the reason I was put on this survey so much was because people didn't hang up on me. All my peers around me, they got taken off the survey because they had too many people hanging up on them and being mad at them about it. I don't know what it was, but people would talk to me about this. So I got to do the survey for as long as we had that contract with Viagra. Well, with that being said, looking into later adult development, we do see that as we move from middle to late adulthood, sexual activity is less and less frequent across middle adulthood and into late adulthood. There are a variety of factors here. Part of them are bodies, aging bodies, having lower blood pressure or higher blood pressure, stress, career, family, less energy. All these things are cited as reasons. If we're looking at late adults, having a partner that you live with is one of the highest predictors that you will be actively having sex. So if we look at the pattern of sexual behavior over the lifespan, for early adults, we see about 33% of people are having sex or are wanting to be having sex about 2 to 3 times a week. And then there's about 33% of people, so about a third are wanting sex or having sex a couple times a week. There's about a third that are having or wanting to have sex a couple times a month. And there are about a third that are wanting to have sex a couple times a year or not at all. So all of those are pretty big categories where a third kind of fits in. As we get into late adulthood, this frequency is decreasing over time. So you are going to have fewer that are having sex multiple times a week, but late adults are still interested in having sex. So keeping up with health, thinking back to our physical development chapter on the recommended exercise, if you keep up with your health, if you're going to the doctor, if you're doing preventative things, sex will be easier for both men and women. And so if that is something that you are interested in, if you're in any of those groups that are interested in sex at any given time through late adulthood, keeping up with your health is one way to help that be a lot easier to do. And then also living with a partner is one of the next biggest predictors. So late adults are interested in sex. So finding partners can be difficult in late adulthood. Maybe people should teach them how to use a variety of apps. that might be helpful. Maybe there might actually be apps, dating apps specifically for late adults. I'd be actually really surprised if there are not. But it can be difficult, right? Finding time, going and meeting new people. So, one place that we actually see a lot of people find sexual partners is in retirement or nursing homes. A lot of people living under the same roof makes it a lot easier to find willing partners. So, with that being said, though, we do see a lot of STIs in nursing homes and retirement communities. Part of that reason is one, there's a little bit less access to safe sex materials, contraception, these kinds of things, but also nearing the end of life, there's also kind of an attitude of, well, it's near the end, doesn't really matter at this point anyway. So again, though, these can be health complications that can add to a risk factor of early death or challenging health complications. So definitely something to be aware of. As we look into late adulthood, orgasm and erection can be more difficult for men. Performance is very much less decreased for women. But this is something that late adults are interested in, is having sex. So thinking about if you are going to be working with late adults, if you're going to be a nurse or a doctor or a therapist or any kind of person who's mentoring or being part of that community, this is something that late adults are interested in. It is a human thing to want to have sex, and people who are adolescents all the way through late adult are interested in it. So this is something that we can talk about, especially in the context of developmental psychology and what are kind of the expectations, what are the risks, what are ways that we can support people and think about our own lives as we age as well. So that is the end of this chapter. Quick reminder, just make sure you are checking your syllabus for what chapter to be reading next, and have a great day.